English presentation of a combined effort from ADFO, CPCO, and OPC, and we're really excited that this is a 3-year project with 3 webinars each year. So we're into year 2, and I'm Judith Desjardins. I am going to co-facilitate with Stefan. I'm a principal with CPCO, specifically with London District Catholic School Board. I'm currently on secondment with School Mental Health Ontario, so hopefully I bring a variety of information to you. I've been a principal or a school administrator for nearing 20 years, so I think I'm in my 19th year right now, so I'm happy to be with you. Stefan?
Hi, welcome everybody. Happy to be again this year presenting with my colleagues. My name is Stefan Bone. I teach in the psych department at Nipissing University and also the child and family department. I've been working now for the last 25 years in autism and also self-regulation, both nationally, internationally also. So I'm very happy to be talking, especially with the topic of today. So welcome everyone, and don't hesitate to ask any question.
And while Stefan and I are facilitating the conversation today, this is a team effort. We have a team of Janine and Jose. Janine and Jose will take their turns to present this year as well with Stefan. And then, of course, behind the scenes, we have from CPCO, Luciana Cardarelli behind the scenes today. She just has her camera off, and we're supported by Nadine Trepanier from OPC as well. And Sarah Morrison. We couldn't do this without Sarah's technical skills and her organizational skills. She sets everything up for us and keeps us on task. So who I didn't introduce is Pierre from ADFO. He will be part of the French-speaking presentation this afternoon with Jose, if you're planning to attend that. And of course, Stefan will be there as well. Okay, Stefan. So this first webinar is one of 3 learning webinars, as we talked about, developed to support school leaders with an in-depth understanding of students with autism as students with a neurological disorder, and how to support the school team to explicitly teach executive functioning skills as a way of scaffolding the students' access to learning and future life goals. The second webinar, this series, will deepen your understanding of the transdisciplinary approach through the lens of equity, inclusion, and a collaborative stance. And then the third webinar this year will explore a leader's role in maximizing the impact of the safe and caring school through our policies and procedures for students with autism, working through the transdisciplinary approach. So as we begin today, and as we begin all of our meetings, we do start with a traditional land acknowledgement, and the one on the screen is from Toronto. Since I'm based in St. Thomas, so that's the London district and surrounding area, I will read the land acknowledgement from our area. And as I do that, I invite you to reflect on where you're coming to us from. So Stefan, we have 133 attendees, more people are coming in. We're coming from all over the province. So really think about the lands and the richness and the gifts we've been given to be upon the lands in which we are at. So for hundreds of years before we stand here today, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Attawandaron, Huron-Wendat, and Lenape Indigenous peoples have sought to walk gently on this land. They offered assistance to the first European travelers to this territory and shared their knowledge for survival in what was at times a harsh climate. Today, we acknowledge our 3 local communities of Munsee, Delaware, Chippewas of the Thames, and Oneida First Nations. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada treaties, including Treaty 6, the London Township Treaty. As people living on these lands, we seek a new relationship with the Indigenous people of this land, a relationship with our neighbors based on honor and deep respect. And as I mentioned, I'm from St. Thomas, and I reflect on the lands all the time. I am privileged to live in a city that is deep and filled with a network of ravines. And at any time, I can look into my backyard and chances are I'm going to see 2 or 5 or 6 deers grazing on the grass that we have there. So I know at one time these deep ravines provided a source of shelter and certainly food for our Indigenous peoples, and I am so grateful to share in that beauty. All of our webinars, as you know, are linked to the Ontario Leadership Framework. Today's webinar in particular will support student or principals and vice principals in improving the instructional program. And we invite you to stay with us. We're going to be about an hour, so at least 45, 50 minutes of talking, and where the opportunity presents, we're happy to answer any questions, perhaps if we have some time at the end. Behind the scenes, Nadine, I think, is going to populate a poll, and we ask everyone to take a moment to respond to that poll. And there it is. So you'll see there's a scroll bar at the side, so scroll down to answer all of those questions and then hit submit for us. And again, we're grateful. We're up to almost 150 principals and vice principals joining us, which is really exciting. I'm hopeful that you're taking this as just some time for yourself as we're working through these crazy days in which we find ourselves. So Nadine, if you can let me know when I can continue to move on.
It's actually Sarah doing it, Judith. But if you have a look at the top, you can see how many participants have responded out of the ones who are here. So I think when we get to about that 80% mark is probably when we can close the vote, Sarah.
So I don't see that information. So I think, oh, there it is. Thanks, Sarah. I just have to wait for Sarah. Like I said, Sarah's behind the scenes, really holding us together. So we can see that we have about 68 coming from elementary. I'm thrilled that secondary have found the time to be with us. We try to write these webinars inclusive of everybody. And current position, a nice split between principals, vice principals, assistant principals. I'm so happy you're here with us as well, and a couple others. And we're all learners. It doesn't matter how many years you're in the position, we continue to learn. So thanks for joining us. And there's a nice distribution from all the regions. Again, thank you very much. Okay. So as we said, if you joined our learning series last year, you'll recall that our first webinar was a deep look at understanding the student with autism spectrum disorder. If you did not get that, know that you can access that webinar at any time through your association, through the membership area. They're all recorded and they're saved there. This webinar right now, Stefan and I are going to build on some of that knowledge from the first year. Stefan?
Yes. Just to really focus as we go on with the webinar is, the last few years we've been talking about autism as a neurodevelopmental disorder. What's key is the fact that the brain maturity, all the developmental domain are affected by it. And because of that, we're seeing a lot of what we call subgroups of children on the spectrum. It affects directly the executive functioning, the language, sensory motor, coordination, social communication, visuospatial skills. And I think it's very important for everyone. And that would explain why a lot of the neurodevelopmental disorder, there's an overlap between some of the behaviors, some of the emotional regulation or dysregulation, and also the cognitive ability. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today, specifically for autism. What has been really the shift also is the fact that now we realize that autism being a spectrum with the new reality, and I did share that last year with the group that did participate. Now when we say about autism, the criteria is to really look, if you're a school principal or vice principal, it's the level of dependency on the adults. The reason why some kids are more functional than others, it starts with the level of dependency. So if they add an EA from kindergarten on, for automatically they will have specific behavior issues as soon as you try to work independent. So today we're really going to focus on the executive functioning, because that's where it starts for any teachers having to deal with a child.
And so as principals and vice principals, we go to what's familiar to us, and we should. And in this case, it's the Learning for All document. So when you're working with your school team to support any child or youth to set up the instructional program, we think in a tiered approach of support. And this is described really well in the ministry document, Learning for All. It states that an extremely effective approach to assessment and intervention is the tiered approach, which sequentially increases the intensity of instruction and interventions. Today, we're going to focus our attention on tiered one, the universal approach to support. The Universal Design for Learning, or UDL as we know it, is a framework that supports the concept that what is essential for a learner or some learners in a classroom is good for all learners in the classroom. So best practice guidelines are developed using the best available research evidence in order to provide professionals with evidence-informed recommendations that support practice and guide practitioner decisions regarding assessment and intervention. Best practice requires the integration of professional expertise. Each student's unique strengths and needs, family values and preferences, and the best research evidence combines together into the delivery of the services. Professionals and families collaborate and work together as partners to prioritize domains of functioning for assessment and intervention planning. We know that best practice for school-based educators are best practices for students and their families. As educators, we're greatly influenced by educational trends. We look to our past and forwards to the future to anticipate the latest trend and the next big thing. We have seen open classrooms, experiential learning, brain-based education, personalized instruction, and professional learning communities, to name a few. Educators, eminently practical and resourceful, have unpacked and reconfigured these ideas to fit their unique students and contexts. Having said that, it appears that the pace of educational change has reached epic proportions. Differentiated learning has evolved into universal design. Personalized learning environments have created flipped classrooms and individualized learning spaces. Curriculum focused on environmental outcomes include outdoor classrooms, play-based instruction, play-based learning, and in today's context, remote learning. While innovation is exciting, invigorating, and necessary, this influx of information also creates stress as educational leaders face continual pressure to change their perceptions about learning and focus on the interests of students' motivation and wellness. Universal design for learning means a scientifically valid framework for guiding educational practice that, first of all, provides flexibility in the ways information is presented, in the ways students respond or demonstrate knowledge and skills, and in the ways students are engaged. And secondly, UDL reduces barriers in instruction, provides appropriate accommodations for supports and challenges, and maintains high achievement expectations for all students, including students with disabilities and students who are limited with their English proficiency. Stefan?
And I think what we are going to be focusing on today is really the executive function component. What I've seen through my practice, what I've seen through research when I do assessment, is the executive function. They need to be taught, they need to be taken into consideration. When we talk about executive function, we need to look at the behavior component, meaning can the child self-control? Self-control should be the main target as soon as the kid enters kindergarten and all the way through grade 12. Self-monitor, so teaching independence, aiming at autonomy for sure. Emotional control, we've talked about that. It's really important that a lot of kids on the spectrum, they have what we call emotional lability. So they have a lot of changes in their mood based on the environment, based on the task, based on the person that's trying to help them. The cognitive flexibility or the rigidity when we talk about autism really puts a lot of stress on teachers because they need to reteach these kids new ways, new process of learning. So it's really important to look at executive functions. There's also task initiation, organization, and working memory.
And just to interject there, we've had a question, Stefan, around the difference between self-control and regulation. Is there a difference, and what might that be?
Yes, self-regulation is the big umbrella that includes different phases. So the first phase that you work on is self-control. Self-control is the ability of a child to inhibit. So that means to stop themselves, think, and look around what's the best option and adapt their behaviors with regards to. So for me, self-regulation includes the overall of self-control, self-discipline, self-determination, and also self-efficacy, meaning the child is fully independent and knows that he has the skill to do it. So they used to share, everybody used to define even executive function as self-regulation. It's totally false. Self-regulation is the umbrella with all the different phases that a child will go through. That's why I like the play-based opportunity, because we're teaching self-control. So that means the child learns the ability to stop and think before acting.
Thank you.
So we look at one of the slides from Lori Face. We're grateful that she's allowing us to use it as well. Executive dysfunction places a child at risk and is likely to have an adverse impact on many areas in their everyday life and affect their adaptability in several domains like the personal, social, and communication. Systematic social skills instruction that incorporates EF processes, components in the delivery program can help to reduce the risk for negative outcomes for children on the autism spectrum. Likewise, it's often helpful to have an assessment of EF skills that can add important information about the child's strengths and weaknesses and inform the intervention and treatment planning. So as Stefan alluded to, executive functioning skills are frontal lobe functions that begin to emerge shortly after birth. And we know that it takes a full 25 years to fully develop in neurotypical students. Adult modeling and shaping is how most student learns. Students with autism struggle to develop their skills through modeling and shaping alone and need practice and explicit teaching. So the question for us is, how are we explicitly teaching executive functioning skills within the curriculum every day as a tier 1 support, necessary for some and good for all? Experts believe that executive function is regulated by the frontal lobe of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, because humans are born with brains that are not fully developed. Children are not born with these skills, but they have some potential to develop them. Some students who do not develop executive functions to the same degree, some students don't develop these to the same degree or the same rate as other students. They need those supports in the classroom every day for that practice.
So I think what's important with what Judith was just mentioning, when we look at executive function, the first element for a child, for example, to be able to take self-initiative, that child needs to be conscious of what's happening in their environment. Unfortunately, young children with autism, when they get into the system, they don't explore the environment. They're always trying to find elements to reflect on. And often if they have an EA, they won't explore the environment, so they don't become conscious of what's happening around them. And so that affects their self-awareness of the cause and effect, will affect their judgment because they can't inhibit their behaviors automatically, then they will react emotionally. So initiation, motivation are part of such key elements that we need to teach. For example, taking initiation, making decision, making choices. It's always the adult that does it for the child on the spectrum, and unfortunately, it affects directly motivation. So the control over emotional response is about self-control. How do I teach new skills? How do I explore the environment with that child? How do I expose that child to experience daily so they can plan, sequence, they can have their memory to remember to do something, because the working memory is the issue with autism. They have a rote memory, but when it comes to working memory, unfortunately, there's major issues. So that's why they have the inability to synthesize signals from the environment. They have inability to assign priorities because they can't organize their thoughts. If you can't organize your thoughts, that means you can't engage in a task, in a sequence of action, in taking decision or making choices. So, and that will bring anxiety. Anxiety will bring to emotional dysregulation. And it's not recognizing emotion. You just make the distinction. Emotional dysregulation is the inability, it's the reaction. It's really out of context to compare what's happening. So the child will behave or interact socially and make plans. He won't be able to do it. They have poor judgment when it comes to that. And like I said, all of this is related to the level of dependency they have on somebody else, because you can't be dependent and learn how to self-regulate, for example, or learn new skills or learn to take initiative.
Thanks, Stefan. So today when you signed up for this webinar, hopefully you saw the opportunity as a principal, vice principal to bring along an IEP. So if you were to look at that IEP, the question we're wondering is, do all children, knowing that all children benefit from explicit teaching of executive functioning skills. However, for students with ASD, the explicit teaching of executive functioning skills is essential to develop tools for life. So how are we as leaders supporting our teachers to plan with our students and their families for life after school? Are executive functioning skills present within the IEP that you have in front of you today? There's a few places that you can look. So perhaps you see that there's executive functioning skills that have been assessed and are listed under the student's strengths and needs within the IEP. Perhaps explicit teaching of the skills appear within the program pages for the subject or as an alternative program page. And sometimes EF skills are discussed as areas to be supported within the accommodations page or on the transition page of the IEP. So there's lots of places to look for it, but the important piece is it there? Are we teaching, explicitly teaching EF skills for students with autism so that they can have lots of success in life outside of school? So can you find that evidence in the IEP in front of you? When working with your school teams, in collaboration with the parents and guardians, during the development or the review of the IEP for students with autism, consider how you can ensure the explicit teaching of executive functioning skills. Consider the items listed on this slide and the multiple opportunities for including EF. Today's presentation will focus on two EF skills, inhibition and working memory, because Stefan tells me that 90% of our students diagnosed with autism have deficits in these two areas. The student's inability to demonstrate impulse control and to effectively use their working memory directly impacts their poor success at school and later in life. While we're only focusing on these two F skills in this short time that we have together, we are providing you with a tool And I'm going to show that to you now so you have reference of it. So this tool we've called Leading to Strengthen Executive Functioning Skills of Autistic Students. And really it's IEP Look-Fors. And we made it so it's available for grade 12, kindergarten to grade 12. So the spectrum, anyone that's here, this tool hopefully will be helpful to you. This resource will provide you an at-a-glance overview of each of the EF skills and the cognitive challenges, so that's in this column here, that the skill area might present, along with how a deficit in this area may present itself for a student with ASD. And then we want to give you potential IEP strategies or Look-Fors. It's our hope that you'll use this resource to support your conversations with your educator teams to support the instructional program for students with ASD. I'm just going to slide that out. So to begin, let's start by looking more closely at the working memory for students with autism. Working memory, as opposed to long-term memory, is the ability to hold information in your head and to manipulate it mentally. You use the mental workspace when adding two numbers spoken to you by someone else without being able to use a pen or paper or a calculator. Students at school need this memory on a daily basis for a variety of tasks, such as following teachers' instructions or remembering sentences that they've been asked to write down. In many cases, students rely on their working memory more than their IQ. Stefan will take us through the cognitive challenges and what this skill deficit may look like for students with ASD, and then he'll make some suggestions on how to explicitly teach this skill.
So some of the cognitive challenges that are really important, one of the key elements when it comes to autism is what we call information processing. There is, and when we do assess and when we do evaluate, there's always what we call information processing issues with autism. If, for example, if you ask them to do a task, if you provide them with some information, they have difficulty with discrimination of the information, and also they will take a really long time delay. So the latency really causes a major issue. So they have difficulty comprehending new concepts or settings. They have often the inability to learn from previous mistake. Once they've learned a pattern, once they've learned a sequence, they tend to always go back to the same pattern, and they have really rigidity to switch and change and listen and adapt. So they'll have difficulty staying oriented to a schedule or to the activities, difficulty registering new information or words that have been learned, especially when under stress, failure to complete the assignment, need for large numbers of repetition. That's why we talk about explicit teaching, to learn a motor sequence, to learn routines, to learn rules, to learn the textbooks information. So never forget that when you ask a child on the spectrum and you provide them with information, please allow them to think about it, to process, because I've seen kids that I've worked with that it takes long minutes to do that. And so they get confused when too much information. So they'll use avoidance or they'll escape that situation. They might have remembering things, or they'll just remember some component. So that's why, for example, if you give them a multiple task with the multiple steps to do, they might remember just the beginning or just the end, but they forget all the different steps. They lose track of what they're working on. They forget what they need to retrieve when they're sent for an errand. They might also have difficulty remaining attentive and focused, sequencing math problems, problem solving mentally, poor reading comprehension, difficulty summarizing, difficulty following direction. So these are all behaviors that through the years we've uh, observed, and we need to teach our teacher to look at that and be able to support when needed. So some of the strategies that somebody could use, it's called the visual technique. So either for non-verbal kids, you would give the sequence in pictures. You could ask a child to anticipate, because anticipation is also a problem with autism. So to really focus on specific techniques, pre-teach. The more you teach in anticipation, the better the outcome will be. Eye contact, always making sure if you want the attention, not just to name Stefan, look at me, but to make sure that you're positioned close enough to redirect the child and ask him question. Provide copy of notes if you can. Practice new skill every day, at least. Graphic organizer, visual, and chunk. That's probably the most important thing. It's chunk the information, do a task analysis if you need to, but that's really key. You can also use mnemonics, like giving them tools to keep track. It could be a conceptual map. It could be, I've used PowerPoints where the kids are putting ideas and then they'll organize their ideas, and then you're able to do a writing task if you have to. Avoid extraneous comments and information. The more you talk, the worse it gets. So I think sometimes we have this tendency to give verbal prompts, and that will create anxiety. Color code, personalize the thought, the information. Student will design their own system. They should participate and use variety of tests that assess both recall and recognition.
Stefan, I love that comment about the more we talk, right? And it reminds me of educational assistants, and sometimes their first go-to is verbal. And we're always reminding our teams, how else can we share the same request of that student, but in a non-verbal way? So it's a good reminder. So as we shared earlier with you in the tool that we are giving you, so this is pulled from that tool. If you start with an assessment of EF skills, then you can add important information about the child's strengths and weaknesses to inform your intervention or your treatment planning, which will inform your IEP. If the working memory is not well developed with a student with autism, you might expect to see some of these strategies or similar ones or similar accommodations within the IEP. So think about a student in your school who has autism. Can you identify where these accommodations may prove supportive to the student's success in the learning environment? And then from a UDL perspective, these accommodations would be considered essential for this student. Yet, we know they're good accommodations for all students in the class. So what we want to do as leaders is help encourage our teachers to understand that and to incorporate it into their daily practice. These accommodations, along with systematic and explicit social skills instruction that incorporate EF process components in the program delivery, can help reduce the risk for negative outcomes for children on the autism spectrum. Let's look at the second EF skill, inhibition, and begin to explore how students diagnosed with ASD have a deficit in this area that directly impacts their success at school and later in life. Inhibitory control, or the ability to control one's own impulses, is a core skill in self-regulation. It helps us to withhold or stop certain behaviors to reach our long-term goals. During early childhood, the adverse life events that the child went through or their upbringing may have undermined the refinement of the children's inhibitory control. Evidence suggests that low levels of inhibitory control in early and middle childhood leads to problem behaviors during later childhood and adolescence. Again, we're lucky to have Stefan with us because he's going to take us through some of those cognitive challenges and what this skill deficit may look like for a student with ASD. Then he'll make some suggestions on how we can explicitly teach this skill.
Again, I think what's really important, and it follows with what my colleague asked, what was the difference between self-regulation and self-control. When you do assessment with children with autism, one of the key impairment is inhibition. So they are really impulsive, because impulsivity really is a result of a child not being able to inhibit his behaviors. So they have inability to suppress irrelevant or interfering information and impulse. So that's why they will easily be distracted by other stimulus. And that's why these kids, they have often will say, well, they also have an attention deficit. No, it's because they have the inability to inhibit. So they have what we call attentional lability. So they have difficulty to engage and disengage. And so inhibition will be more with disregard for others or the social norm. As soon as there's something that happens, you'll say no to a child with autism, automatically you'll get an aggressive outburst, because kids on the spectrum, everything is based on association, task, environment, people, situation. So as soon as they get involved, and if we didn't teach them new behaviors, unfortunately, kids on the spectrum, they go back to what they've learned, and often it's their autistic trait. So they'll try to compensate with that. And if it includes aggressive behaviors, then they will have these behaviors really showing, and that's going to have an impact on cognitive impairment. The more you fight self-control, the less ability you have for cognitive engagement. So they have difficulty waiting. So as soon as you say something, automatically they'll start moving or they'll start acting out, and you're not finished explaining, or you're not finished telling them what they're going to do. They might interrupt or disrupt group activity, because if it's group activity, if they've never learned to even work with one other child, and then we're asking them to be in group, that's a bad call overall. So the student may call out because they don't develop what we call private speech and self-regulation. As soon as there's something, there's no filter, they will say out loud what they're thinking internally. So cognitively it affects, so inhibition will play there. They'll touch things, they'll touch people, they'll make careless mistakes, and then if you try to correct them, then they'll have an outburst. They will display hyperactivity. That doesn't mean that they have ADHD. It's just that they will get overexcited based on the inability to act properly. They will make false starts. So you might say, okay, listen, this is what we're doing. Automatically, they'll start their work. And then you say, that's not what I asked. Or you add and you say to the student, stop, and I forgot to say that. Then they will react and they don't want to restart. So they will dive in problems without pausing, reflecting, or finding a strategy. Excessive talking, that's when they're stressed, when anxiety is there. So they'll ask because they're trying to compensate because they don't have the answer. They won't be able to self-monitor their behaviors, and they will often misinterpret the direction of what's happening with them.
Stefan, before we go on, Jessica's asking you to comment on the differences or what to look out for between autism spectrum disorder and ADHD when it comes to EF.
Where the two diagnoses are quite similar, it's the what we call private speech. Both disorders, being neurodevelopmental disorders, both population, unfortunately, they have main issues with problem solving. So they have inhibition issues because one is incapable of finding the answers, and the other one is he's able to plan. Like a child with the ADHD is capable of planning. It's just that he gets impulsive too fast, compared to a child with autism is they are easily distracted. And so attentional ability is it's impossible for many kids on the spectrum to engage, disengage. ADHD is a true attentional deficit. So they are always the same. If they do a fun activity, they will disengage. If they do something hard, they will disengage. The child with autism is because once they engage, they don't want to disengage. And if they don't engage, it takes them a long period of time.
Thanks, Stefan. So moving to some of the IEP strategies or suggestions for explicit teaching.
So one thing that's really important is to give explicit and clear rules and explanation. That's one thing that really gets the children on the spectrum upset. If you change the rule, if they're not clear, then it needs to be black and white. There's no gray zone. The seating component of it, it depends of the profile of the child. For example, I see often with an EA will sit the child at the back. That's the worst thing because they have all the stimuli in front of them. So as soon as somebody moves or raises their hand or, you know, gets an object, the child will disengage and go there. So it's preferable if they're in front, and so at least it's there. We're helping them. Catch the student being good. That's really important. Ignore disinhibited response, like talking out loud or saying comments, because the more you do that, the more you're reinforcing the negative behavior. Use checklists. It works really well with them. Have student all pencil up until direction are given. And that would apply to ADHD and also autism for sure. And make sure that before they start that they clearly tell you what they have to do. What do I have to do first, second, and so on. So because they need to verbalize before learning to internalize problem solving skills because of executive functioning. Verbal reminders are not verbal prompts. It's just reminding the child so they're saying it out loud. Model your thought process, how you got there, what did you do first, and so on. Ask question to make students stop and think. You can use the SODA method. The SODA method is stop, observe, decide, and act. That really works well. I use that all the time. The stop sign, if you have any signals you want to do, procedures of an assignment, and identify the skill to be worked on.
I I stepped away because I thought, soda, you haven't shared that with me before. I like that one. So stop, observe, decide, act. Soda. I like that. Thanks, Stefan. So again, using an assessment of EF skills can really add important information about the child's strengths and the weaknesses, and to inform the intervention or treatment planning. Again, inform the IEP. If inhibition is not well developed in the student with autism, you might expect to see these or similar accommodations within the IEP. So again, I ask you to think about that student with autism in your school. Can you identify where these accommodations may prove supportive to the student's success in the learning environment? Again, from a universal design for learning lens, these accommodations would be considered essential for this student. Yet we know that they're good for all students in the class. So again, using your leadership influence to help classroom teachers to develop just really good practices. It's essential for the students and it's good for all. So let's embed it within the regular classroom instruction.
I'm also, Judith, sorry, we're seeing a couple of questions pop up in the Q&A. I'm going to suggest that we save those for the end, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. So we know that these accommodations with systematic and explicit social skills instruction that incorporates EF process components into the program delivery can help to reduce the risk of negative outcomes for children on the autism spectrum. And what we've neglected to say so far is that you've got resources within your school board to help you, your positive behavior support teams, your BCBAs. You have other people that can come in to help incorporate EF into for that explicit and systematic teaching of skills. So as Stefan said earlier, the research findings contribute to the growing evidence that children with autism who participate in social skills interventions that integrate EF, such as working memory, cognitive flexibility, emotional recognition, and self-regulation, they experience growth not only in the improvement of the social competence, but also the underlying core neurocognitive EF processes. And as you know, we can all improve our EF skills. So as leaders, how can we set the conditions to support our teachers to better understand EF? How can we support them to teach EF as a tiered one approach to support all learners in their classroom? We know that EF is essential for students with autism spectrum disorder. And we know that good EF development is good for all students. We want a school where educators are continuously asking themselves this: am I providing each student in my classroom with an equal opportunity to be successful? If not, as an educator, what variability Do I need to add to my planning to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity? So when educators can identify the potential barriers to learning, they can then proactively plan the necessary supports and increase the likelihood of the student's success. There's lots of information about EF, and we've just listed a few go-to places or researchers that can help you further if you want to take this to the educators in your school. Finally, let's think about this quote in terms of the expectations that you and your staff have of students with ASD in the school. You wouldn't throw a non-swimmer into the deep pool of water and expect them to swim. And yet, every day, autistic people are pushed into the mainstream society and expect it to function normally. So as a school leader, how are you supporting students with ASD to learn in an environment that is set up for their success? So let's circle back to the IEP that you have in front of you today, perhaps, or the one that you might look at a little later on. How is EF directly being addressed within this IEP? What needs to be celebrated in the IEP? And perhaps what needs to be considered further? What's your next leadership move? How will you engage staff to better understand the explicit teaching of executive functioning in their classrooms, and in particular with their students with autism? We're really hopeful that the tool that I showed you earlier, I'll just quickly drag it again. We're hopeful that this tool will provide you with a starting point for some of those conversations, and you'll use it as Look-Fors. So if you're reading an IEP for a student with autism, pull this out and you should see some correlation. And if not, you can start to have some conversations with the staff. If you feel that this tool is going to be useful, can you just give us some feedback on that in the chat? Just put a couple comments, that would be helpful, because we can always refine this and make it better if it's not serving your needs. Just going to pull this out. And I think this is a good time, Luciana, if there's a couple questions that we can address in the few minutes remaining.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing lots of positive affirmation on the tool, Judith. And you will all be receiving access to this via a Google Doc that will be emailed to you in a follow-up email. So watch for that in the next day or so. We have had a comment or a question asking if Stefan might be able to make a comment on FASD versus ASD and the EF correlation. So between fetal alcohol syndrome and ASD and EF in those cases, and what might there be in terms of similarities and differences with respect to relevant strategies?
That's a very good question. There is a lot of similarities when it comes to the behavior components of it. The main difference is the maturity of the brain. So with FASD, inhibition is way more of an issue based on brain development. With autism, often it's the inhibition issues are related to the lack of exposure to learning new skills. So even kids with FASD, when we provide them with opportunities and all that, the fact that the brain is affected, is damaged, often they can't self-control. So they are very impulsive, and then often cognitively, they will show cognitive delay way more than a child on the spectrum. So the cognitive development and also inhibition with the FASD is really related directly to brain maturity as compared to autism. Often the inhibition is based on the way the brain function. It's more like a computer system where they need to know all the steps. With FASD, sometimes even when we provide all the explicit teaching, they still don't grasp the information. So FASD is self-control, very problematic. Emotional control, very problematic. And anything to do with working memory, task initiation is very hard for them. With autism, you can work on self-regulation. I've been doing that now both in Ontario and in other provinces, but also in France. You can work self-control, you can work self-discipline, you can work self-regulation, because the brain will readapt once they understand it, they can do it, but the damage of brain development is different.
Thank you. And we have another question with respect to flexible learning spaces. Andrew asks, with teachers using flexible learning spaces and defronting classrooms, what might preferential seating look like in these cases?
Is she asking me or Judith or?
Could be both of you. I would open it up to you both, to be honest.
I always pause, Stefan, because I figure, you've got all of these answers. I was just flipping through in the chat. Someone had asked to see the tool a little bit more slowly, so I did that. So in a defronting classroom, I love it. It really is taking a look from the students' strengths and needs perspective. What do they need? What are they distracted by? And put yourself into that child's chair. Is their sight lines minimized so that it's going to focus on what you're hoping they'll focus on? Really, I think it's just looking at it from the child's perspective and what do they need. And I always encouraged staffs that I worked with, start with our kids that need a special place to sit first, or consideration of where to sit first. Start with them and then build the rest of the class around them. So I hope that helps you a little bit.
And I think if I can add just for that and for everyone that are working with autism, make sure that the child is not using more peripheral vision. Many kids on the spectrum, they tend to use peripheral vision. So if you put them in front, and so they will always turn their head to look, and that also explains why many of them, especially if the predominant eye is the right one, they will read from the right to the left. And so if they're trying to decode, it's really an issue. Peripheral vision is a major neglect in the field of autism that often people don't consider. So that would also explain seating in the class.
Wow, those insights really make a difference as we view our work, no question. We're having questions come up around seeing particular slides. Please note that you will receive a copy of this PowerPoint in the follow-up email, so you'll be able to have access to all of this. Our whole goal is that you can use this and share this further within your circle of influence, whether that be with colleagues, staff, or wherever you see it best utilized. We also have a question here around evaluating and consistency in evaluating a student's progress in an IEP, specifically around EF. Are there any tools or guiding strategies for gaining authentic data that will be able to be used in communication with parents, students, and teachers? Is there some sort of pre-diagnostic tool or a tool that can give you a range, that sort of thing?
Yeah, there is, and that's an awesome question. I appreciate the person that's asking that. The tool that I'm using right now, because I've been working with self-regulation and EF now for many years, we're using the brief. The brief is a observational scales. You need to know the child for a minimum of 3 months, and you will measure self-regulation and all the executive functioning. The beauty of it, it doesn't take a psychologist to do it. The parents, there's a version for the parents, there's a version also for teachers. Once you fill that out, you will get where the child is with regards to task initiation, with regards to organization, with regards to flexibility, inhibition, self-regulation, and working memory. It's one of the best tools that I've used. Easy to use because all the questions are already there. You're just answering them.
And Stefan, can you spell brief for those that are asking?
Yeah, BRIEF. Just write.
And I would suggest your ASD specialist or itinerant at the board would likely be able to give you more information on that. We are at the end of our time virtually, and we do have some questions that we really seek your input on. So thank you so much, Sarah. We would ask everyone to engage in the poll that you see that's come up before you.
This information is so important to us because, as we said, it's a 3-year project and we really try to be responsive to what do you need. And so this information is really, really helpful. So thank you for taking the time to fill that out. And as you're doing that, as we shared already, this is recorded, so you've got it. Maybe there's sections of this you want to share in a conversation with staff at a department meeting or at a staff meeting. By all means, use it. The resource, we hope that you do use it. We hope that it's sitting beside you on your desk when you're reading the IEP, or when you're engaging with families and guardians about how to best support. It helps us to see behavior differently, doesn't it? We start to see what are the skills that the student doesn't have yet, and how can we support them to develop those skills. So the glossary and all the references, all of that is part of the slide deck that we have here. So go ahead.
Go ahead, Judith. No, go ahead.
I was just going to.
After you, madame. So Kathy, I see you have a question. If you'd like to hang on just as we close, we'd be happy to address that question with you. And back to you, Judith.
I just really wanted to say again, it takes a team to create these webinars for you. And so I'm so grateful to be part of that incredible team, grateful to be working with Stefan. It's a shared endeavor between the three associations, a terrific partnership between ADFO, OPC, and CPCO. So I'm so happy that you were able to join us. We had attendance up to 160 individuals. So thank you for taking the time. I know how exhausted you are. I know how many things are being given to you and asked of you as a school leader. I get it. I've been there. So thank you for being with us for this period of time. Spread the word to your colleagues that weren't able to join us today. That's okay, but the resources are available. And if you missed last year, take a look at them too when you have a chance. It'll just impact how you see children with autism and help us assess the conditions for their success even more. Luciana, can you add when the other two webinars are? I don't have those dates in front of me.
It's one in February and one in March. I can tell you that for sure. And just let me flip to my calendar and I may be able to give you the specific here. Oh, let's see here. I want to say about this same time next month.
Luke is telling us it's February 23rd. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you so much, Luke. Appreciate that very much. And March 23rd. There you go. And as we are at this point, then, if it's okay, Judith and Stefan, I'll throw out Kathy's question. She's looking for some advice on how to guide an EA when supporting a child who first arrive in a kindergarten play-based environment. So it's all about that initiation and getting them
Stefan, I'll start, and then you can pick up. So anytime we're welcoming any student, be it kindergarten or anyone that's new to our school or new to a new classroom, you really want to work with the parents and the team that knows the student best. So perhaps it's a previous daycare, perhaps it's a previous teacher or school. You want to work with them to understand, who is this student? Who is this child? What are their strengths? What are the areas that we're looking to develop? And it's from there that you begin the conversation. Educational assistants assist, and we want them to allow the child to grow their independence. So not to take over for the child, but to allow the child to grow in their independence and only step in when there's needed support. They're going to help to teach some of those explicit skills that we talked about today, but really focusing on the EA. How can we set the environment up for this child to be successful? How can we set the environment up so it's predictable and the student knows what their day will look like? And then we're facilitating. How do we facilitate peer-to-peer interaction? How do we facilitate communication? How do we facilitate parallel play or interactive play? It's the EAs helping to facilitate. Stefan?
I think and that's an awesome question, because I always question what's the real role of an EA. The EA is there at first to be, she's acting as the intentional self-regulation for the child that comes in. So they should always rely on the teacher's cues and then wait and then redirect the child. But they need to put the routine in place and then do a lot of anticipation. So always when the child is calm, and motivated, you teach them in advance what's going to happen. So the routine, when it's time to go play, when it's time to transition, I think the first step is always self-control for me, no matter if you're autistic or not, and then from that is then I will make sure the EA or she's doing intervention. So she should never be sitting beside the child. She should always be standing up behind if she needs to redirect or if she needs to prompt, but then always pull back so that the child can vicariously learn from other kids by imitation and all that. These are all the skills we're looking at: imitation, joint attention, the ability to take initiative, to be spontaneous, and all of that. So that's what the EA should be focusing on.
The EAs also are great opportunities for gathering the data that the team requires so that we know that we're making the right progress too. So I wish you well as you have those conversations.
All right then, so seeing that, we've had one last question, if people don't mind. Just again, a very quick explanation of what brief is.
The brief is a standardized observational skills with a lot of questions that will measure self-regulation, will measure organizational skills, will measure flexibility, initiation. So that tool is to provide a profile of the child with regards to the behavior component, the emotional component, and the cognitive component. So if you do in the best world, that's what I'm hoping eventually, we would use these tools at the beginning of the school year, and then maybe once at the end, we will see if our tasks, our strategies are really helping executive function.
And thanks, Luc, for giving us the full title and stretching out that acronym. And thank you, Stefan. On behalf of everyone, we really want to say a thanks to everyone, and of course to our incredible ASD team. Today we heard from Judith and Stefan. When we come back in February and March, of course, we'll be hearing from Janine and Jose, who are other members of our team. It is such an honor and a privilege to be learning with you and from you. And to all of our participants, the exact same message. God bless you all. Take good care and be safe.
Thank you. Have a nice day.